Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Charlene impressed me through the creativity with which she dealt with the sudden loss of her mother. She used her professional background as a curator and brought it with her when she took the time to empty the dream house her mother spent the last years of her life in. Charlene describes the process of carefully honoring and making decisions about physical objects, holding memories, and deciding how she wants to remember her mother, and she offers guidance to others to do the same. About this week's guest, Charlene Lam is a certified grief coach, speaker, and the founder of the Grief Gallery. After her mother died suddenly in 2013, Charlene leaned into her creativity and curatorial instincts to guide herself through grief. Since then, she's curated and presented multiple exhibitions featuring the belongings of loved ones lost at international events in New York City, Los Angeles, Toronto, and London. Charlene believes we are all curators after a loved one dies, and developed her Curating Grief coaching framework to help people process grief in a creative, accessible way. She speaks about the power of creativity and storytelling for healthy grieving and post-traumatic growth. Originally from New York City, she is currently based in Lisbon, Portugal. I hope you enjoy today's podcast episode. So welcome, Charlene. It's so nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. The beauty of Zoom, connecting Switzerland and Lisbon.
So how are you today?
I'm grounding, meaning I'm actively working on grounding myself. Mm-hmm. It's a really busy time. I'm preparing to go to Los Angeles next week to do some installations for the Grief Gallery, which is so fun. And because it's so tied in with my own experiences of loss and thinking of my mother, my head is like a bit in a swirl, more than usual. So I'm trying to calm my body down and ground and not get too frantic. I don't like feeling frantic.
Why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about your life and how grief and loss has touched your life?
The major loss that I have had is my mother. My mother, Marilyn, she died over 10 years ago, January 2013, and it was very sudden. She had a stroke and she was just gone. And at the time, she was living in New York, which is where I'm from, and I was living in London. I really do describe it as being blindsided. Life was going so well, and then suddenly my aunt sends me a message. Have you heard from your mother? I can't get a hold of her. We all kind of found out at the same time, trying to call her. And I was on the phone with my aunt. I was on the phone with my uncle. I was emailing my friends. I was messaging with my cousin. We have all this technology now, right? And none of us were expecting it. She was the healthiest of all the family members. And I just knew, oh my gosh, my 2013 is going to look very different. And obviously the rest of my life is going to look very different. And I did spend the next 2 years of my life figuring out what to do with my mother's house, with her estate, and with all of her belongings. I'm an only child. So I knew I was the one that was going to have to do all that work, make all those decisions. My aunt was the co-executor with me, but she kind of told me, you decide, I'll just help. So it really did just take over my life for the next 2 years. flying back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, figuring out what to do. I think on a practical level, and also on an emotional level. What do I do? Now what?
Well, given the way you started telling your story, you haven't mentioned your father, so I must assume he wasn't right next to your mother or in the pictures as such as if you were doing all the things.
Yeah, my parents divorced several years before my mother died. So her life looked very different, and she underwent a lot of changes in her last years. I grew up in New York. My mother moved to New York when she was 15 from Hong Kong. So she was a proud New Yorker, as am I. And we're both proud Chinese American New Yorkers, like I like to say. And we moved to California when I was 10 years old. And that was a huge change for us. I was living in New York, in Manhattan, in Chinatown, and we had family there. I lived next door to my uncle, and we moved when I was 10 to this little town in California that was very white, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was just culture shock on many, many levels. And even though I move quite a lot in my life now, I do often associate moving with loss.
I was just thinking that that was a predecessor of this most significant loss, as you describe your mother.
Yeah.
Already moving as a 10-year-old, and you just named it. It's loss of surroundings, I suppose, friends. I mean, I moved a lot when I was a child, so I dislike moving.
Yes. Yes, this most recent move to Lisbon was different because I think it was the first move that I initiated and that I did not associate with loss and trauma and circumstances outside of my control.
Yeah.
But we can come back around to that. But certainly that move from family, from familiarity in New York to California, that really was a formative experience. And it was a loss for my parents as well. It was really difficult for them. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a lot to handle. And just like with death, my parents didn't know how to support me. They didn't know how to break the news. So that really added to that. But the significance for my mother is that after my parents divorced, she moved back to New York. In, I would say, maybe the last 5 to 10 years, she moved back to New York. She reconnected with her friends. She had her dream house by the lake that was all hers, and she decorated it exactly how she wanted. She asked me what paint colors to use in her bedroom. And I'm so glad she had that experience, even though she didn't really get to stay in that house for very long. So, yes, it was really just her living by herself, but reconnected with friends and with family. And it was just me, as the only child, knowing that even though I have family members, I knew very early on instinctively that I would be taking care of things by myself. I think that's also what I preferred, frankly.
But the way you described her story of moving back to New York and the importance that New York has for both you and your mom, the way I heard, it sounds like the place where she lived, her house and the things, the way she wanted it, had then a great significance for you in your dealing with the loss of your mom.
Oh, yeah. I think the word that was coming up for me as you said that was homecoming. Right? It was a homecoming for my mother. And when I think of her dream house, I remember telling a friend who was in Europe, I think my mother bought this house and really renovated it, expanded it to become her dream house. And what it actually became was my safe space. It was my cocoon. I tried to hold on to her house. It took me almost 2 years to empty it out and to decide what to do with it. And that was such a luxury. It really did not make financial. to have that time, right? In the time since, I've spoken to so many people about their experiences of cleaning out houses and dealing with the belongings. And I have a colleague who said, I had 2 weeks to clear out my mother's apartment after she died. And I think I would have lost my mind. I really do think that would have led to a breakdown. My mother's loss was so sudden, so out of the blue. Just getting my head around the fact that she was gone took me years. I couldn't imagine trying to empty out her dream house in that time as well. So it really did become my safe space. It was almost like a retreat when I would go there, because it was beautiful, view of the lake and trees all around, and it was quiet. I could put on music and dance. I would put up artwork. I would eat all of my favorite comfort foods. And it really did feel like a retreat.
Like a grief retreat on your own, dealing not just with her things, but with your own feeling towards being here without her, I suppose, right?
Yes. And I could... Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting because when you're talking about that, I am sitting here so we have this parallel that both of our mothers died through different circumstances. So my mother committed suicide or died from suicide. It's going to be 13 years in January. And I'm sitting here in the place that she lived. So I'm looking out into her garden, which she loved her garden. I'm looking at mementos that are here that are basically hers, because the way it happened for me was we had decided to come back from Australia to come and live in Switzerland. And my parents were just visiting over Christmas, and then they went back, and then she died. And so we came within weeks for the funeral, and then we stayed here. Mia had a small baby at that time as well. I was staying here for 3 weeks, and I was going through her things just a little bit to sort of consolidate things. And so my father was still living here. But then he sort of broke the question. He said, well, when you come in August, which was then the plan, do you want to come live here? And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't have the sense of whether I would be, whether I could live in the house where she died. So I said, I come and try. I don't know. But so I'm still living here 13 years later in the house, which was the last place of home for my mother. And so there are so many things that, first of all, we had to create space for us, but also so many things still. I mean, even if I just look around on my desk, I could show so many things that have absolute connection with things that she left behind.
Yeah. Yes, I was thinking that too. That what's your relationship with the house now? Because I imagine, you were questioning, what is my relationship going to be with the house that she was in and that she died in? And my mother died in her house. So that was also, I did have my own space. Part of the expansion for her house was a guest suite. And we kind of told her, don't think that we're going to move back here, right? Don't do this for us. But she had built this kind of guest suite. And so we would stay there when we would visit, my husband and I. And that's where I would stay. So I did feel like I had my own safe space. Her bedroom stayed untouched. I would go in there during the day. I would talk to her, and that's where her urn was. But at night, it kind of creeped me out. So I would lock the door. I would, scurry past it because I was like, well, what if it's haunted? I don't even really believe in that. But when you're alone and it's quiet and it's dark, sometimes familiar spaces look a little different and your mind kind of goes there. So I'd be curious, what's your relationship with the house now for you?
So when I look back, how was it first and how is it now? That might be interesting as well. So first of all, my mother died not in the living spaces. She died in the garage. I remember the first, I don't know how long, months, years, every time I walked down to the garage, I would think to myself, this is the last way she took. consciously to end her life. And that to me was both confusing but also interesting in a way, to be so clear about what she was doing. Maybe not in her world at the time, but in my world. The other thing was, when I first got back and I knew where she died, I had this big fear around that place, because I felt, oh my God, what is the energy in that place? But I needed to go to that place immediately. When I first arrived, when I came for the funeral, I went to that place where she took her life and stood in that room. And I was completely confused by the energy and sensation I had of light, of brightness, as well as, and sounds weird, but I heard, or I imagined, sounds of angels singing. And because I have clarity so much, because that moment is burned in my memory, I had this sound of angels singing, and I was saying it to the people around me. This is what I'm experiencing. This is not a dark place. This is not anything that I have to be afraid of. It's confusing to me, but this is how it is right now. And since then we put things in place to make that a space of light and a memory place of her, because that's where in my world, she exited this world and she went to the other side. Now it's very much my space. Obviously, we had to create space for us. We moved in here as a family of 3, and my father and my mother were living here. So there was a transition period of still being theirs. And then he moved out and it was just us. So it took some time, and we redecorated certain things to make it ours. And still, there's obvious places that are still very much a memory of them, or of my mother being the custodian of that space. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And I think, I've met you a little bit, right? But it's so interesting how you describe the sound of angels singing, because the impression I'm getting is that you don't necessarily talk about angels usually.
No, it's not the first thing that comes to mind in relation to death. And
yeah.
I was just experiencing that in that moment. And I was, as I said, I was confused as to hear that, because I was expecting darkness and pain because of the way that she decided to die. But that wasn't there.
It's interesting how our relationships with the person shifts over time, and our relationships with the house, like in your example and in my example as well, and our relationships with the physical objects, that they evolve over time, our relationships with them. I think for me, my mother's house, I often describe it as an anchor, that it was the anchor that I needed right after she died. It was my safe space. It felt very stabilizing. It was my retreat. And then it started to become the kind of anchor that keeps you stuck. And it started to feel not light. It started to feel really heavy. It started to feel like a burden.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I really knew, I think I need to sell it. I think I can't afford to keep throwing money at it and to burn through her retirement savings in order to try to pay the mortgage and in order to try to keep the house. And there was a moment where it became very clear to me that I needed to sell it. I had been feeling this very heavy kind of feeling like I was drowning in all of the physical objects and all the stuff for a while. But when you were referencing where we imagine perhaps them to be, or how different parts of the house feel, yeah, at night I would kind of wonder, oh my God, what if she's haunting the house? And one, I don't want to imagine my mother haunting her dream house. That's not how I want to remember my mother. I don't want to remember her or think of her or imagine her haunting this house that she loved. Like now I like to imagine her traveling because that's what she loved doing. And I realized that when I was in her house, it was like I was haunting her house. It was this massive house. There was no one else in it. It was surrounded by darkness. And I was just shuffling around in it, not living my own life. Because my husband, my work, all my actual belongings were in London still. And I didn't want to haunt my mother's house either. So, yeah, I do find that really interesting how our relationships with the places can change.
So how do you feel that personally? How did grief move through you? What helped you grieve? What helped you move out of that stuckness as you described it just before?
It really was permission. I think I was lucky in that now when I work with clients and when I talk with people, the topic of permission comes up so much. Am I doing it right? Is it okay to keep things? Is it okay to get rid of things? So-and-so says I should do it this way. There's a lot of offering permission because people seem to want it or need it. But I think from my own experience, I was lucky because I was given permission and gave myself permission to grieve and to process in my own way very early on. And for instance, I was in London when I got the news that my mom was dead. And I knew, oh, okay, I have to, get on a plane. I have to fly to New York and figure out what happened and what do I need to do now? And I just kind of instinctively knew I want to make a checklist. I'm going to make a spreadsheet. And that's the way I process. That's the way I cope. And no one challenged me about that. In the years since, I've learned, we have different grieving styles. And there are people who are instrumental processors who grieve and process by doing, which is very much me, versus intuitive processors who are more emotional and process by talking about their feelings, which is more like other family members. But very early on, I just knew, I know this is how I cope. And that's okay. I never really judged myself for that. I only cried really when I first found out. And then I didn't really cry that much until 2 years after, until after I'd sold the house and really kind of finished that phase of dealing with my mother's death.
Mm-hmm.
And also very early on, flying to New York. I knew I did not want to stay with family members. I knew I wanted to book myself a hotel. So I booked a hotel for 5 nights. And I think I eventually extended that hotel stay to 10 nights because I instinctively knew I'm going to want to be alone. I'm going to want to have my own space. I'm going to not want to have to worry about managing other people's feelings and reactions. And I'm so glad I had that instinct and gave myself that permission. And looking back, I think my mother was the inspiration for that. She, especially in the last decade of her life, really figured out, you know what? I want to do things my way.
How to give herself the space that she needed, literally.
Yeah. Because people said, well, why would you want to live outside of New York City? Don't you want to live in Manhattan? And she said, no, I want to live by a view of water. I want to have a house. I want to have a garden. And a lot of people questioned it. A lot of people challenged her, I'm sure. And she was stubborn. She liked to do things her way. And I think that really did give me the inspiration to grieve my way and to take care of myself my way. So I'm really, really grateful for that permission. I think that was key for helping me to heal.
Mm-hmm. All these things that you've experienced, and you already alluded to the process of dealing with the house and the belongings, also propelled you in some way towards what you're doing now and how you're supporting others. So tell us about that transition from grieving your mom, and I suppose that before you were just someone doing whatever work that they were doing, grieving your mom, and then making this a purpose-driven something in your life that came to fruition?
I guess I knew that losing my mother would change my life in many ways, but I didn't expect it to change my purpose in life and my work. When my mother died, I was working as an independent curator in London, and I was also working with creative businesses. So I was helping ceramicists and jewelers to figure out how to show and sell their work. Because my background was in journalism, and it was marketing, and it was in visual display. And people in the UK, they do beautiful work. They have amazing schools. The quality of the jewelry is museum quality. And there were 20-year-olds making a living by making shoes and selling ceramics. And that was such a world away from what I knew in New York. And I realized, oh, they're doing beautiful work and they don't know how to sell it. They don't know how to show it. They don't know how to tell their stories. So that's how I started doing that in London. And part of that work was doing pop-up exhibitions. I would curate these exhibitions and showcase the work of these amazing makers and artists. But the problem was, when I was in New York, part of what kept me stuck really was dealing with the belongings. That I'm very attached to physical things. I love my stuff. I like shopping. I like trinkets. And I was making very little progress in cleaning out my mother's house. I couldn't choose what to get rid of. I would watch home organization shows on her big TV, and they would say, oh, you want to do these boxes and like categories of what you donate and what you keep and what you put in the trash. And it wasn't working. Intellectually, I knew that's what you do, and I was not moving objects out of the house. I really wanted to keep everything. Everything felt really precious, even the ugly furniture, even the things that looked like junk before. So I leaned on my creativity. I really did kind of put on my curator hat and said, okay, what if I was to curate an exhibition about my mother? In the same way that I do exhibitions in London, which objects would I choose to display? And that question, it changed everything. It was, I think I even gave myself a number. Yeah, I think the question was, if I was to do an exhibition about my mother, which 100 objects would I display?
Okay.
Because I actually found the label on a box in the storage unit that still had the label 100 objects.
Oh, cool.
So I need to take a photo of that. And that actually solved my problem. It got me unstuck. It wasn't easy, but I did start making choices. I did start putting things in that 100 objects box, which made it easier for me to let go of the things that didn't make that cut, that didn't fit that criteria. And it was a theoretical question at the time, but about 2.5 years after my mother died and about a year after I sold the house, I did my first exhibition in London featuring my mother's belongings. And it was beautiful. It was meaningful. It was the memorial I really wanted to give her. And the response from people was so touching. And people were so open about sharing their own stories about who they lost and what they kept. And it was the most beautiful experience I've ever had. Well, I've actually had a lot of beautiful experiences since then, but that was such a shift in my grieving process. And that was the start of the Grief Gallery, which is my creative platform for doing exhibitions about grief and loss, featuring the belongings of people that we've lost. And this idea of curating, it also forms really the framework, the heart of my work as a grief coach, because there was something so empowering, and I'll say it again, so beautiful about using that lens of curating to go through my mother's objects and belongings.
So what is actually the meaning of curating? What does that mean? What is, if you were to give it like a 1 or 2 sentence summary as to what is the job of curating? What does that mean? Is it choosing, or is it more than that?
I define curating as choosing with intention.
Okay.
In the way that when I curated exhibitions featuring the work of artists, I would choose with intention what takes up space, what tells the best stories for that exhibition.
Okay, well, that's really good explanation, and I think it is meaningful in relation to what we're talking specifically about, what choosing what makes sense to carry on forward. Because if I look at what you were talking about, you said this got me unstuck, and I was thinking, and I was looking through the trauma lens at that, and you tell me if that fits. One of the things we see is that, for example, if grieving and the pain of the loss is coupled, as to the memory of my loved one is coupled with that pain. So I cannot let go of the pain because that's the only connection that I have. And once we uncouple that, the people can get unstuck and can remember their loved one also without the pain. So I was wondering whether in your situation that there was, and you tell me if that fits for you, if there was a coupling to her house and all her belongings as to this is what you have from your mother that is still here, and letting go would mean letting go of parts of your mother, and something in the process of curating was to symbolize all these 100 objects with the whole of your mother.
For me, I don't think I necessarily had the belief that letting go of the objects meant letting go of her. I just knew that everything felt really precious, that everything felt really meaningful. And I think it was identifying actually what is meaningful, what is actually meaningful, what actually tells the best stories about my mother. I don't have to keep her toothbrush in order to tell the stories that I want to about my mother. But certainly with other people that I've spoken to, that is very much a belief that if I let go of my grandmother's piano, it means I'm not honoring her memory. If I give away my husband's clothes, will I start to forget him? That's a really common concern and worry. But definitely for me, it was that choosing. That first exhibition was 8 years ago, just last month. And I think back to the artwork that I had in that exhibition. And one of them was this piece that really, I think, encapsulates that process of curating and why it's helpful. So I had the series of words, and one was, "This is how I remember her. This is how I want to remember her. This is how I want her to be remembered."
Okay. Fascinating.
So that, even back then, I had no idea that I was going to be helping people with their grief. That was just somehow my expression of that process, where I think we start with, and now I ask people this, I turn it around to you and to other grievers. How do you remember your person? All the ways, how they died, the circumstances of the loss, conflicts in the relationship, the good things and the bad things. And then how do you want to remember your person? Right? Like you said, you start to choose, you start to untangle the good and the bad, you start to highlight and spotlight different moments, different memories, different facets of them. And then interestingly, when we take it to an exhibition setting, when we ask, what do you want to put on display? We bring it to the question, how do you want your person to be remembered? There's something there about creating legacy, about something for a public audience, something that's not just our personal relationship with them. And it was all very instinctual for me at the time. And in the years since, I've been wanting to understand, why was that so helpful? Feel free to offer your insight. I know there's meaning making that's happening in there. And from a cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral coaching standpoint, there's making choices and interpretations.
I can add one.
Yes, please, please.
Because I was just listening to you, and one of the things that popped into mind as you were speaking is as if it's like a process of creation and deciding of how the continuous bond is being lived. And then the third step you mentioned, how do I want my person to be remembered, is like a continuation of, if we're assuming continuous bond is just me and my person, but then it's like, how do I want this continuous bond to be lived by other people?
I love that. Because definitely continuing bonds theory is one of my favorites. I do think that the physical objects and the meaningful objects can play an important role in helping us to continue those bonds. I love your addition that the exhibition or having a display or having meaningful objects that other people can see can be a way for them to continue their bonds with a person. And I think it's also related to the roles that we play. You know, at some point, I think, okay, I'm the custodian of my mother's objects by law. And then I assigned myself to be a curator. And then it became, okay, am I the keeper of my mother's objects, or am I the keeper of my mother's stories? Am I the keeper of my mother's legacy? Am I the keeper of her stuff? Because they're actually different. So thank you so much for that insight.
I think it's beautiful. And as you already shared, you're helping people come to that place where they make this continuous bond, make this meaning, and all the processes that come out. And all these links will be in the show notes. One of the things that came just as a picture when you were talking about this process that you go through is as if, you know, if we're unconsciously grieving, then the things that we remember are just the things that come up. But the way you describe it, it's really making it conscious, and there's a conscious choice as to what and how you want to remember it. And it's as if the picture now comes into place. What I saw is like this continuous bond. You decide how the ribbons in my picture will look like, and how the ribbons from other people, you give them options as to, this is how you can remember my mother. Now, obviously, they make the choice as well, but it's like as if you were to give them different ribbons to choose from.
Oh, that's a beautiful picture. I love the idea of ribbons. I think threads, because textiles and sewing is, well, it's a thread through my family's history. But I love the idea of ribbons. And I think part of what I've found to be really helpful, one, there's that idea of curating and what you do with the physical objects. But like you said about other people's bonds, it's an offer, it's an invitation of ribbons. And as you noted, they might not accept it. And what I've found really helpful is offering this analogy and this metaphor of an exhibition to help people better understand how other people would curate an exhibition about the person. Because so often when we're dealing with the kind of fallout and conflicts after someone dies, it's with the people who are still alive. And definitely when we're talking about estates and we're talking about physical objects, I spend a lot of time with my grief coaching clients. Yes, we talk about their relationship with the person who died, but a lot of time is actually talking about conflicts with siblings, with other family members, with friends who don't understand why they're holding on to that object. Someone is upset that the thing that they really loved got thrown away. How is it that something that is so meaningful to me is meaningless to them? Does that mean they don't care about me? Does that mean that they didn't love the person? What does that mean? And using that analogy of exhibitions, I find, gives people a different way of looking at the physical objects and also seeing how other people respond in their grief and in the aftermath of that loss. Can I give you an example?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I hold a free monthly grief gathering for the Grief Gallery. And I say, imagine that we're in this imaginary gallery space and you have a display pedestal in front of you. What are you going to put on that display pedestal? And what story are you going to tell? And that's what that person curated. That's what they chose with intention. And then we kind of do an exercise and say, okay, now say that your brother walks into this space. What did they think of that object? Would they have chosen that object as a way to remember your person? Sometimes yes, but often no. They had a very different relationship with the person. They have a very different way of grieving. They might choose a different object. In a gallery setting, we can understand that, right? That you might love a piece of sculpture and I might not like that style. There's the artist's intention with the work. And then there are all of our individual interpretations and perceptions. And it's like, oh, that style of art is not mine. You know, oh, I really relate to this other piece. Yeah. But in that art gallery space, we're not taking it personally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the point.
Yeah.
It's very close to heart.
Yeah. So I love using the exhibition analogy in that way. Because it does offer a different way of seeing and perceiving. And I think that's also how I see coaching and art. So much of that is about different ways of seeing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I find that really powerful, and it's a accessible and more fun way to process, I think.
Mm. So thank you so much, Charlene, for all this insight, and it's got me really creative in my brain, and I can see that when I look around now, there's so many objects that have memories and have meaning for me just around me. So I'm going to be looking at those things from a different point of view, which is fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all that.
Thank you. I know we're almost at time, but I'm curious, is there like a specific object that's in your eyeline now?
Well, actually, there is one, and that is something interesting because my mother made it in memory of my daughter when my daughter died. And it is a candle holder. It holds a candle, and she actually put the name of my daughter in gold letters, and she put golden stars, and she put golden wings sort of around the candle. And she made this as a significant way to remember her grandchild at the time when she was still alive, and so it's still up there. So would it be okay to finish this up with the rapid fire question?
Yes, sure.
So grieving and trauma means?
Processing whatever comes up. It's an active process.
And healing means?
Softening and being open.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of loss and trauma?
I can do hard things with a soft heart.
Oh, that's beautiful. And what would be one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
We will all experience it, and we will all experience it differently.
Absolutely. And then if you were to name one thing beside the Grief Gallery that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss, what would that be?
I learned unconditional love for myself. I was able to take inspiration from the unconditional love that my mother had for me and to learn how to apply that to myself.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing not just your story, but your mother's story with what you're doing and how this has become such a fruitful avenue to help others.
Thank you. My mother would be thrilled. She would love that I'm talking to someone in Switzerland about her and her inspiration. And I think she'd be proud of me. And she would say, oh, remember that trip we took to Geneva? And like I said, she loved travel. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about her.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.